So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to a very important topic on COVID and anti-oppression work and how they intersect. I am Kiara Sarner. I am a sexual violence prevention specialist and certified sexual violence advocate. And I will be moderating today. And with us on the panel, we have Annika Leonard. Annika feels that wherever she goes, she's called to create spaces where deep healing can occur, particularly in the lives of Black femmes, women, and girls who are impacted by violence. Annika has a Bachelor of Science in Human Services and a Master of Business Admin from Cardinal Stritch University. Her continued studies and 15+ years of experience honoring and holding space for people most impacted by violence allow her to be present and offer, in forms of the workshop keynotes and guide us to be more in alignment with our truths. And I believe her company is called Priceless Inside. Next, we have Wanda, Wanda Swan. She is the executive director of the Swan Center for Advocacy and Research. She is the founder of Start by Talking as well, which is an anti-racism education company that supports leaders in interrogating their relationship to anti-Blackness and white supremacy. And then Wanda also is an anti-violence expert. She has over 15 years as well with direct service and prevention strategy. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Jayden Fields. Jayden is a survivor, a poet, a community organizer, and the co-director of Mirror Memoirs. And this is a national storytelling and organizing project that uplifts the healing and leadership of LGBTQIA+, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who survive and identify as are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. His work within grassroots and nonprofit organizations have included designing, leading programs for trans folks to access health services, training government agencies to better serve transgender people, participating in action research and policy advocacy as well. So we have a panel of experts, as you can see. Thank you very much for joining us. The first question, I believe, goes to you, Annika and Jayden. So how are you seeing survivors in your community responding to COVID-19?
So I think that the survivors are deeply impacted. Like, we've already seen how anti-racism is in full effect, how anti-Blackness, anti-immigration, how all of those things have been in full effect pre-COVID, right? And so now we have COVID happening, and it's just really amplifying the needs of survivors just across the board. And it's actually making it worse. We've had some of the highest rates of contracting COVID from being frontline workers. A lot of young people, while they were quarantined and safe at home, experienced sexual assault at higher rates. So just across the board, we're seeing a lot of young people being impacted in a lot of communities that were already at the margins being impacted even more, and then being basically experiencing some of the same things when they seek help within the systems, right? So you contract COVID, you go to the hospital. A lot of survivors who are at the margins already have experiences that are not favorable when they've accessed the medical system to begin with. And so now we have COVID going on, and like some of us already have trauma from hospital systems and don't want to go to the hospital and now experience even more trauma, in addition to, maybe having our symptoms not believed or taken seriously when we express that we have some concerns over contracting COVID. So we also have, like I said, high death rates and high contraction rates. And so all of those things within itself cause us, to be on edge. And then we haven't even included survivorship into this equation, so those are my thoughts around it. I think that it's just amplified some concerns and some needs that were already in the community. And as a result, it's causing us to maybe try to shift some of the ways that we're doing this work in terms of being a gender-based violence movement.
I just want to add that COVID is another pandemic that many survivors have already been navigating. It illuminated for most people the systemic barriers a lot of survivors are facing, especially non-white people in this country. So survivors have actually been responding to the reality of COVID, if we're thinking about that part of the question, by doing what we've always done, leaning into mutual aid. I think the rest of this movement is catching up to the ways survivors have always done it by supporting each other and not being dependent on systems. So a lot of the survivors and the communities I'm a part of have been amplifying mutual aid. A lot of folks have been doing things like crowdfunding for themselves and for each other, that have, and providing each other with access to tangible resources beyond what a lot of organizations are able to provide communities. And so with my work, we have been shifting to support and uplift that survivor-led work with actual resources like money, you know what I mean? So yeah, COVID also impacted folks. A lot of survivors in the work that I do are like gig workers. And when COVID first started, a lot of folks lost all of their income. A lot of folks who were either essential workers or doing the kind of like nightlife work. A lot of community that I work with is in the nightlife, and all of that shut down. And so folks lost a whole year's worth of potential income, and were navigating heightened risk of poverty, being unhoused, even though there was a rent moratorium and a pause on evictions. A lot of folks, because they were also queer and trans people of color and Black folks in particular, who were already navigating unstable housing, were then further pushed into being unhoused and into homelessness. So, which just, then increased the risk of contracting COVID. So a lot of folks were already in the crosshairs, and the impacts of COVID really pushed them further into more violence and harm. And there were already strategies in place of community care and networks of care that folks leaned further into and elevated.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for sharing on that. The next question, you've already touched upon quite a few of the topics here. Wanda and Jayden, this one is for you, and Jayden, I know you spoke to some of this just now. But this question is asking about the realities that the pandemic exacerbated, right? Which, like I said, you did touch on, just in terms of there was already a pandemic going on for them before COVID hit, right? So, taking into consideration the intersecting marginalized identities, and, how has that been exacerbated? And, specifically for Black, Indigenous people of color. And so, Wanda, we haven't heard from you yet. If you want to start us off.
As it relates to the question, the realities of how this pandemic exacerbated life for survivors of color, right? I think both Annika and Jayden touched on this in some really concrete, tangible ways. And I think that's the thing. I think that what I want to speak to or thread together is what they showed, is that the interconnectedness between the lived experiences of folks like that. That's hopefully, among nothing else, that is what I want people to take away from this, is that what we have to understand about how oppression works is that it is an interconnectedness that impacts all aspects of folks' lived experiences. And when we're talking specifically about folks whose lives are or whose identities are already unfavored by a system of whiteness, whose skin is already deemed to not have any value or less value than others, right? Whose humanity is negotiable in ways that other folks' humanity is not, right? We are talking about the various ways that this same system in a time of crisis further does the work of creating less opportunities for these particular folks to thrive and to be. And so I feel that, in looking at some of the ways that both Jayden and Annika talked about specifically, right, what this oppression before COVID, right, and what means folks took in order to save ourselves before COVID. I think that what COVID exacerbated, I think that COVID was a reveal, right? I don't think that COVID necessarily, I think that there were folks who were marginalized, who are marginalized, who absolutely, as the system turns, right, absolutely was less thought about, absolutely were, whose humanity were less considered. But I also think we have to understand that COVID is not the boogeyman here, that there are lots of other boogeymen that were here way before COVID. There are lots of other dangers that happened way before COVID that created the type of lack, this type of this type of lack that happened. And so I want to say that COVID is not the disease here. COVID is a symptom of something larger, right? And I think that if we are talking about people who have already survived so many other monsters, right? I think we have to also be able to acknowledge those other monsters, right? Because Jayden, I think you said it perfectly. You said we do what we've always been doing because we've always had to be doing because we've never been safe. And I think for a lot of folks who have been deemed minoritized by this system, right, or been treated in that way by this system, it is one more burden that they have to carry. But I don't see it as this particular specific, monumental moment that cuts through and creates a change that never happened before. The suffering that happened is still happening. And so I think that, my answer is more so based around trying to kind of knit those previous answers together, because I think that's the larger picture.
Yeah, thank you, Wanda. I think as you were talking, and I don't want to derail us too much here, but I think as you were talking, I'm hearing a lot of similarities to some of the, I guess, police brutality that's now being caught on camera, right? Those things were always there, but people are aware of it. And I wonder if COVID is a very similar, people are just maybe seeing more now or paying attention to these things, but they've always been there. They've always, like you said, I think all of you have kind of alluded to, this is not the first pandemic, so to speak. And so I'm just seeing a lot of parallels there. If any of you would like to speak on that, please feel free. I don't want to move away from the original question because Jayden, I know you probably still want to speak to that as well.
Yeah, just to add on to what Wanda was saying, like, I think if folks are stuck in the question of like, what has the pandemic done, then we're asking the wrong question. The pandemic hasn't done anything. Like, white supremacy and capitalism created the perfect environment for it to exist the way it does in this country. Like, we can't pretend that things like health are neutral. Like, they're not. Nothing is neutral because white supremacy and capitalism are embedded in everything about how this version of this country works. So it will always first impact Black people because this country is set up, you know, as an anti-Black white supremacist lie. So first and foremost, we need to shift the question. And this isn't the first thing either, as you were alluding to, that has unveiled things for folks. Like there have been many movements. And if we're just thinking about this movement of, you know, gender-based violence broadly, like the beginnings of that in this country were by a Black trans woman. So like all of these movements have constantly been unveiling. There's just been endless moments. But the issue that happens is that people get complacent after a while. You know, there's some Band-Aid shift. You know, we have these panels and folks for a moment are like, okay, we'll try this new intervention. That isn't really a new intervention. It's just something that the folks who've been in this forever have always been doing. And then people get complacent again. And then there has to be another big thing, another loud moment for folks to finally pay attention again. And so I think, yeah, the reality is we're never, like, they were always real for survivors. I say a lot that safety is elusive for the darkest of us. And that's the reality that COVID revealed to people for whom that isn't the reality. And so I think even the question around how does this uniquely affect BIPOC, it's the same way it always has. You know, I think a better question is, what are you planning to do with this knowledge now, you know? And thinking about like barriers, well, you haven't asked that part of the question, but I'm gonna go ahead to it. You know, what are the barriers to accessing resources? I think, one, the assumption that these organizations within this movement have the resources. What really these organizations have is the money, but often gatekeep access to these resources and healing. The assumption that these communities don't already have community grown resources is also an issue. We always have. You know, I think the fact that there are still Black survivors in this movement and alive speaks to the fact that we have tools to stay alive, because we have to acknowledge that white supremacy is like in this long practice of genocide, you know, like we have to get real about what we're really talking about. Like that's the reality. We're living through genocide, and COVID is able to become a tool of genocide because of how this system is set up to actively not respond to those who are most in need. So, does that make, am I making sense? I know y'all with me, I see y'all not. So, I think, yeah, we have to stop pretending like it's the pandemic and not like it's the system that allows the pandemic to work like this. Like it doesn't work like this in other countries, you know, like other countries have responded differently that have other systems.
Yeah, thank you, Jaden. I don't think you used like this language specifically, but going back, you know, just like the larger topic of sexual violence prevention, right? This idea of like the micro level versus the macro level, and how you're saying like, you know, people on like the micro level, they know, right? And then, but the power is in this like this macro level spot. And so there's always this disconnect there. Okay, so the next question that I have for all of you is for Annika and Wanda. The question is, what are some of the new innovations? What do we need to adapt, given everything that everybody's just spoken on, right? What do we need to adapt to then support survivors, both from that micro and macro level?
I think what we need to adapt is basically going back to the days of when the movement was, well, before the movement was co-opted. So adapting, like literally, we have a title of centering the margins, right? But like when we actually think about what it means to center the margins, that's where I think we get into the, okay, now this is macro and this is micro. Centering the margins means that there is only the micro. There is only the people who are most impacted by, in this particular case, by sexual violence, right? So that means that all of our direction in leadership comes from the people who are most impacted and not from the people who are giving the funding to the organizations to serve the people who are most impacted. So we need to flip that. That is the innovation. And there's a lot of talk about it. People make statements, people, have webinars, people, like do all of these things to say like, oh, this is what we're doing. And the innovation is to actually do it. It's because like if there's no reason why we are in this movement. And this movement was started by Black trans folks. And we fast forward to now we're in 2021 and there's no difference between what was started and co-opted. Like there's no difference in where we are right now. Survivors are not better off, especially survivors that are quote unquote at the margins. We're not better off. And so to me, that means that there needs to be a complete like flip the table overhaul, because the needs of the grantors, the needs of the system are priorities. It's not what survivors need, because if it were what survivors need, then systems and institutions would be leaning more into mutual aid, like Jayden mentioned before. Systems and institutions would be leaning into more accountability for their anti-Blackness, anti-immigration, anti-indigeneity, anti-everything that is contributing to the wellness, or to the, not the wellness, but to the harm that is done. It would be a complete overhaul. And we've done studies, there have been papers, there have been focus groups. We have all the information that we need to completely change the system to benefit those who are most impacted, and yet it's not done. So the innovation is to actually do the work. The innovation is to actually like hand over the macro level power, because I think that's a nice way to say that, it's white supremacy. That's what it is. So the white supremacy would need to end in order for us to be able to be centered in our experiences, be put at the forefront of what's happening, So there wouldn't be a group of professionals at the table reviewing grants. It would be survivors who are boots to the ground, who are, who are looking at the grants and saying, okay, this organization should get the money because I know that they have my best interest at heart, and not the colleagues of the people who are, who are not centering us to begin with. So to me, the innovation is to actually like use all the reports that have been created, use all the statistics that have been gathered, use all the funding that has been collected on behalf of folks who barely benefit from it, and then remove those barriers for folks to actually access the services. I remember I did, well, during my work in Milwaukee, there was a funder that did a report, and they asked survivors in the community like why they weren't going to sexual assault service providers in the area. And that funder turned around and funded the same organizations with no accountability to survivors in the field, in the community, who were saying that we don't go to them because we don't feel welcome, we don't feel heard, we don't get what we need. There was no accountability to survivors. So like, what are we doing? Are we just handing off money? And then if we look, I can go on all day around this. So innovations would be, and I know LaWanda has a lot to say as well, and also you both know I'm the president of your fan club. But I'm gonna hand it over to LaWanda, and just to sum it up, like the innovation is to do what needs to be done, and we already know what needs to be done, so we just got to do it.
One of the things that dropped in in my spirit when I heard Annika talking is innovation without action is simply a daydream. And we can sit up here and daydream of this world that we want to see happen. But we have a whole stack of papers and resources and truths that we have not touched, right? And so that's why I was giddy, Annika, because you were giving me so much. There were so many pieces that were plugging together. This is my jam, and it is my jam because, you know, as you said, I am a scholar, and so a lot of the work that I've done for nearly 10 years is the work of researching the Black founders of the movement, right? And it came after a point of extreme frustration with this movement, with the fact that who has been embedded in this field for also 15 years or more, was at a point where no matter how often I tweaked and tucked and pleaded and pulled and pushed, people who look like me were being treated differently in this system of advocacy and care. And foolish me thought that it was something that I wasn't doing, but it was actually my mentors who told me, no, you need to go back and you need to go and find the Black founders of the movement. And I say that to say that it was in that journey that I was able to gain a better understanding that every question that we have about this movement and the best ways to support all in this movement has already been answered. And it was answered probably around 200, 300, 400 years ago, 500 years ago in this country. This is a movement that was founded on Black feminist abolitionism. This is a movement that was founded on the idea that there are no such thing as little tents, that all societal ills are interconnected, because the folks who started this movement were enslaved, formerly enslaved African folk who said that even though I'm in a country that does not value my humanity, even though I'm in a country that is trying to convince me that I have no access to right of power, that I am subhuman, I know better. And I know that with everything within me, I possess an energy source that is comparable and comparable to folks who have the highest amount of privilege, and I deserve what they have, and no one deserves to own my person. And so a lot of the ways that we continue to do this work in this field has roots in the ways that these folks set up this system. And that is even housing, transfer of housing. If we're talking about speak outs, enslaved African folks did speak outs. We're talking about legislative advocacy, enslaved African folks were trying to sue people even when the courts kept telling them, you're not human, you don't have rights. So the ways in which we do this work, right, are already so connected to how this work began. And Annika, you said it, right? We're talking about co-opting, and I call it the Swiss cheese effect. What happens when people who are interested in one part of the movement but are not interested in liberation gets a hold of the movement is that they shift it and they make it more comfortable for them without doing the work of interrogating why this tension happens. And so you have this Swiss cheese effect of pulling out these organically liberatory systems that is created so that all humans, all humanity can be recognized, and they're replaced with monitoring systems like law enforcement, like some aspects of social work, right? And these systems, right, are replaced, right? These organic systems are replaced with these monitoring systems that are harmful to communities of color. And then we call that the movement. Everything that we need to know, that we want to know about how to turn this around is already here. We don't want it. And so what we have to do, and in my work every day, I work with folks who are executive directors, who are embedded in this work. I work with them in interrogating just how their work is doing the work of being in alignment with whiteness. Because what I learned from that research journey nearly 10 years ago is that this field is complicit. This iteration of this field is very complicit to whiteness, very reliant on the carceral systems, very reliant on the very means and connected to the very systems that cause harm. And very similar to what Annika was saying, like at what has to happen is there has to be an acknowledgement that there are people in this world, that there has to be an acknowledgement, I'll say this, that white supremacy loves nobody, and that white supremacy has no one's best interest at heart. There also has to be an acknowledgement that though white supremacy does not love any of us, there are some that benefit from it. And because there are few who benefit from it, that means there are also folks who don't. And if you do benefit from white supremacy, you do not have the right to say that you have an expertise in what the lived experience of living in a country, in a world that does not value your humanity looks like. You don't have the expertise to make decisions on what funding looks like. You don't have the expertise to make decisions on what healing should look like. And so that should go to the people who have expertise in just how malicious whiteness and white supremacy can be on dark bodies.
At the end of what you were, just describing, you had mentioned the incarcerated population as well. We know generally, and also because Wanda just put it so eloquently, that COVID-19 has really impacted incarcerated folks specifically. It's increased the hardships and injustices that were already there, right? And those generally under the criminal legal system. So what must we do to increase those systems of care or resources for that specific population that is, really at the margins in terms of all that intersectionality that goes into it?
I would like to say that I think we need to ask the folks who are most impacted. So to me, that means finding out who in the community is like the go-to leader, and that could be informal, because a lot of times it is informal in our communities. That could be informal. That could sometimes be like a formal system as well. But for the most part, finding out who that leader is, and then like giving them the money to do the research, to, ask their people what it is that they need, and then asking them, not even asking, but paying them to, to give you this information, because let's be clear, a lot of people are being paid, and, the people who are most impacted are not, benefiting from people learning about their experiences. But, we have a lot of organizations that, get to go around saying, oh yeah, we know that this happens and this happens in this community, and they get to be the experts in this. I experienced some jail time at one point in my life, but I'm definitely not a formerly incarcerated person, and I don't want to pretend like I am. But I know that, like, as a person who has experienced interactions with the criminal legal system, that those systems are horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And I'll just share just a really quick story. I had some experiences last summer that led me to need to call for some assistance from the criminal legal system. I had to call the police on behalf of someone, and when I did, and went through a whole process, including accessing some of the service providers in the gender-based violence movement, and the results of that experience was me not being given what I needed by the criminal legal system, or what, you know, was needed by the criminal legal system, because the judge did not believe that the incidents happened the way that they did without the police intervening. And all of it makes me cringe, right? Because I already know what it means to call, you know, the police, right? I already know, but it was requested upon me to do it, and I did what I need on behalf of who I needed to do it for. And so to go through that process and to not get what I need, and I'm not even at the margins, right? So we're told that we need to, so what I think is, for a lot of organizations in the gender-based violence movement, we need to really just end our relationship with the criminal legal system. Because who is it helping? It's not helping us. Most of us don't even call the police. Most of us don't even go to the hospitals when we're sexually assaulted. Most of us don't even do all of those things because we've already had prior experiences that show us that we're not going to be treated with care. We're not going to be treated with humanity. Our dignity is in question. So what are we even doing with the system, with the gender-based violence movement, and our relationship, incestuous relationship to the criminal legal system, I will add. And so back to the original question, I would say, ask folks who are most impacted, pay them, pay them for their, sharing their experiences, and pay them adequately, and then I'll hand that over to Jayden, because I know Jayden is gonna blow it out the park as usual.
I think we need to expand our understanding of surveillance and the state's agents. Yes, it is the criminal legal system. It's also the mental health system in this country, both of which were rooted in anti-Black racism and had its roots in criminalizing enslaved and formerly enslaved Black folks. If we're going to be honest, all of those things are tools of surveillance and enslavement. One. So we have to think about it like that. We have to really expand, because I think folks believe that the ways that mental health works isn't also deeply harmful and violent for survivors, for especially Black survivors, and especially Black queer and trans people, Black women of all genders. It's uniquely set up to harm us. So COVID just exacerbated, or COVID didn't really exacerbate, it just revealed how these systems were working perfectly fine at harming all of us. The system of mental health and people who are agents of the state in that system surveil people in order for them to access resources, and can have control over how folks are able to access resources. And it's the research shows that more Black people, for example, get diagnosed with schizophrenia. But I think a lot of the responses that especially Black folks have are rational responses to genocide. And if we go back to the roots of, every system in this country, medical, every system is rooted in anti-Black racism. But if specifically, we already know about the history of police coming out of the slave patrols, and the mental health system has its roots in giving bogus diagnoses to Black people. diagnosing folks with things like drapetomania for trying to escape enslavement and torture and rape, and so the history of all of that is rooted in anti-Black racism. And how we surveil people is in service to the state, which causes continued harm to Black survivors in particular. And things like whatever, for this movement to really shift, I guess, like Annika was saying, we can't be dependent on a carceral response to anything. Because when Black survivors, if they call the police, often are criminalized. And if we're going to be really honest about it, are raped again. Like, the amount of trans people who are criminalized after being sexually assaulted are criminalized and then sexually assaulted again by the police, sexually assaulted when they're housed with the wrong population of people, and then prevented from accessing adequate services. Like, so I think to increase access is to give up the money, like these organizations, I think, need to understand that because we're all agents of the state, and just be honest about that. Like, ultimately, tangible and long-term care isn't going to come from these organizations. So they can give their funding, and that means like strategic partnerships with grassroots organizations that are actually connected and doing the work that's reflective of the communities that they serve. And that means, if you can re-grant things with low barriers for reporting their grants. COVID, people, it unveiled the toxic work culture that exists within nonprofit organizations, and some of the funders started leaning toward trust-based reporting and trust-based funding. And that meant that instead of requiring ridiculous funding, like grant reports and stuff like that, at ridiculous timelines when people are just trying to respond to like the intense need of this moment, shifting to allowing people to like have more flexible deadlines, or do like video reports as opposed to writing a grant report, and like things like that, to just like, for these organizations that are doing the real work, but have often not had access to tangible funds. I think the nonprofits within this movement need to shift in thinking who has the wisdom. Like, yeah, you can hire people into leadership in your organizations and give up the money to these grassroots collectives and organizations and groups that are directly impacted and doing and have so much leadership. Like, I think that's the answer. Like, the leadership is out there. Listen to them, give them time, resources, and money, and then shut up. Like, honestly, I think too often we have these conversations and people are like, this is it. Okay, they told us what to do. We listen to them. And it's like, no, like Wanda said, like, without the action, it's just, it's nothing. Like, increasing access. Yeah, that's just that. The barrier is the money. People have the leadership and wish they had the time, and we have to acknowledge that a lot of these grassroots and community collectives like are in the practice of transformative justice and aren't dependent on the carceral system, and are creating and maintaining ways of responding to harm without depending on a system that is trying to kill all of us. Like, that's the reality. And we can't talk about like this particular like uniquely marginalized community without naming, like, we're still talking about Black people primarily, like that's still, we're still talking about white supremacy, like all of that, intersectionality, I think people, since it's become a buzzword, people misuse it and don't really know what it means anymore. And so to remind you, it means that there's this larger system that exists. And as you know, I've heard Wanda put it, you know, this caste system with whiteness at the top and blackness at the bottom, and the darkest of us at the bottom. And that, you know, all of the other identities exist at the same time under this system that ultimately wants all of these things to die. You know, and so, you know, yes, I think in this particular movement of you know, anti-sexual violence, ending gender-based violence, whatever, there are, it's a violence that can harm anyone, yes. But rape culture is a tool of white supremacy. And so even the folks in this movement who are survivors and whiteness is a layer of protection. Whiteness means you're more likely to have access to the healing that you need and aren't coming from legacies of sexual violence. Like this isn't just my trauma, this is generational, historical trauma. Feel me? So, yeah, the incarcerated to support, to bring us back to the question, to support access or increase access or whatever we want to call it. It's that paradigm shift again, like we've all been saying, like instead of centering, like I think we need to shift away from this idea of centering the margins, because that still has this way of sort of like, okay, we're all just looking at you now. And it's like, no, what we need to do is recognize that if folks are on the margins, that means that you're in the center. So you need to move and uplift. Like the folks on the margins aren't quiet, you know, like there needs to be a shift in the circle. And to truly like increase, like people have systems of care, people have resources, they just need the funding to keep doing what they're already doing. And so ultimately, knowing that like the long-term, tangible, true connected care that people will need to heal through being a survivor isn't going to come from these nonprofits in the movement. There can be resources that will come from them, but like the true deep healing isn't going to come from these nonprofits, and these nonprofits do have access to funding. So how are we getting the money out to the people who are going to do that work? And know that like just stay in your lane. Your lane is to provide a certain kind of resource, you know, and recognize your role as an agent of the state and like surveilling people. And it's like, it's not saying like, okay, whatever, don't take government fund, like whatever, you're going to get the funding where you can get it from. That's okay. But recognize that all of us who have to report anything for grant funding, like that's a way that we have to surveil survivors. So like, what are we doing in that? How do we challenge that system, even though we're an agent of it? And I think these are the questions that we need to start thinking about. We have to go beyond the 101 of like what this moment is. Like, this is an opportunity for folks to get beyond what did COVID do, but understand what did COVID reveal.
Thank you so much, Jayden. There was so much raw, authentic vulnerability that came out as you were answering and responding to that. So the next question is for all of you. It's our final question. And it's one that I'm very interested, given in everything that you've said thus far, what your thoughts are on this. So how do you think that COVID, which we've also identified as not really COVID, will impact services to those at the margins, right? In the long term? So what, I'm trying to be balanced here. What hopefully optimistic things do you think have the potential to come out of this, right? If we do things according to everything that you've just discussed, right? What types of positive things does it have the potential for us to move in that direction of? And what things are you worried about long term?
So I think it's important to say that Annika, Jayden, and I have these conversations often, right? And so, like, we friends in real life. We have these conversations often. We support their support here, and for me, I have the opportunity to sit in a lot of spaces with a lot of people across this country. And there are very few places that feel like home away from home. And Annika and Jayden provide that no matter where I am. And to be able to sit in a space with them, to have a conversation that is this real and raw, and this so what I don't think, I want people, no matter what, to understand that there are solutions and there are gems and there are pieces, masterful thought work that was done and was given in this space. And I'm just so thankful to be able to say that I know these humans, and that these humans have befriended me in this movement. It feels like when I'm with them, it feels like on the road to revolution, I stop to pick flowers. That's what it feels like when I'm in spaces with them. And so I just want to say that because it's important that the labor that comes from doing this work, and having these conversations, and sometimes feeling like you have to scream in order to remind people that there is a whole ass genocide that is wiping us out simply because it can. And the way in which this system that started and it was born from the necessity of survival became chopped up into very little pieces. And we are starting to have conversations about I feel like often I'm having to have conversations about my left arm or, my right foot, but not the whole body. And that's what it feels like sometimes when I'm having these conversations, when we're focusing on one piece and not understanding that this is connected to something that's much larger. And this is connected to something that the reverberations across my person, right? And so I wanna thank y'all for holding a space for that, because I don't get to do that with a lot of people that I'm on panel with, because oftentimes people are tired, people are raggedy, and they always come with the truth that is hard and that is so labor intensive, and they never phone it in. Y'all never phone it in. And so I'm just taking a moment to love on y'all. Okay. Now to the question, how will COVID impact BIPOC folks in the long term? And I understand also that a lot of the framing of it is, given that the world is burning down, given that all is lost, what are some positive things that, if we're able to transform this world in the ways that you all just dropped gems about, what can we look forward to? And the anti-oppression coach in me understands that that's also a piece of whiteness working, and the I also understand that it is important for folks who are in this movement to also continue to stay, right? And how do we stay is the question. I feel like that's the real question. How do we stay committed? How do we do this work? And how does this happen? And so my answer, how will COVID impact BIPOC folks in the long term? COVID will impact BIPOC folks in the long term the same way that the flu does, the same way that the common cold does, and the same way that diabetes does, and the same way that all other forms of ills do, right? The question is, how does the system, how will the system threaten to utilize these pieces, right, to sustain inequities if in the long term, if we don't ... And so in an effort to create space for a gleeful ending, I am going to say that I think what we can do, I think that there needs to be a focus on understanding who needs to lead and who needs to lend. And so I think that is that, because if we focus on that, that is going to take us, that's going to teach us how to treat COVID. That's going to teach us how to treat diabetes. That's going to teach us how to treat all these other ills, right? The main piece that we have to remember is we have to reshift our lens on who needs to lead and who needs to lend. And I talk about this a lot with white identified and white assimilated EDs in this movement. It is an understanding that because we have to center and we have to prioritize and we have to own that this movement, the way in which, if we're really wanting to dig in and do this work with the goal of eradicating violence, we have to know that the way in order to do that is to understand that there needs to be people leading who has experience that is specific to the type of genocide that is happening. And for those who don't, they need to learn how to lend their time, their spaces, their shmoney, right? And I often get, when I'm coaching, I often get white executive directors who say, what am I supposed to do? Am I just supposed to leave? Am I just supposed to like quit my job and throw my house away and, you know, give this away? And I'm like, we don't want your house. We got houses, we got our own. But what we want is what you can not even begin to put a value to. We want the ability to be able to be the expert on the experiences that impact us first and most. We want the ability to own our experience fully without it being co-opted, without it being funded and taken away from us. We want the ability for you to not just focus on our toe and our elbow, but we want the ability for you to see the wholeness of us and understand that we have the right and we have the wherewithal to solve our problems. And Jayden, when you said we need to stop looking at centering the margins and we instead need to understand that that only means that there are people who are looking in at us. And there's also this assumption that folks who are on the margins are just waiting to be rescued and saved. And that's not the truth. Right? When you center the margins, make sure that you're not centering this idea of white savior complex that's going to allow you to put your cape on. That's what I want us to understand. What does it mean to lend? And what does it mean to value and trust expertise of folks who have experienced this particular type of genocide, the root of this, that from which all other forms of violence spring, right? Because oppression is the rhetoric that validates violence. Oppression is the rhetoric that says it is completely okay for you to not see someone as fully human. That within itself is steeped in a relationship of whiteness and Blackness, and everyone else in the middle are either erased or rushing to not be Black. And we have to own that. And if we have folks who are filtering this from their place of expertise, and this is where they sit to create the change, what springs forth is liberation. And until we do that, we're going to have a COVID problem, we're going to have a diabetes problem, we're going to have a shingles problem, we're going to have a measles, a mumps, a migraine, and everything else, because it all comes from that. That's what I'm offering as my last thoughts. Thank y'all.
In terms of the question, I also want to kind of go back because there was something that I didn't have a chance to say that I wanted to speak to. And that was the fact that we also have survivors who are working within these organizations who are experiencing this pandemic, this new pandemic for some, but some of us are, like quite used to being faced with houselessness and, responses that are disproportionate from the criminal legal system and things of that nature. So some of us are used to that. But the survivors that are working within the movement that are Black, that are on the margins or have been marginalized, have been pushed, to the side, I wanted to just call and bring attention to the long-term impact of those survivors who have had their humanity questioned, who have had their sanity questioned, who have had their ability to speak and advocate for themselves criminalized. Like I'd like to just kind of just drop that and leave that where it may lay, that we're speaking about survivors, that sometimes we forget about the survivors who are within our own organizations and who are within movements, who are also impacted and who are also, not only impacted by COVID-19, but impacted by white supremacy and the way that it operates within our organizations. And so while we're thinking about like the long-term impact, I would reframe that to the long-term impact of white supremacy after COVID, if we will, but also like the long-term impact of white supremacy on survivors who are providing these services to other survivors. And that oftentimes, if we look at the work of like the Women of Color Network, we see that there are so many survivors who are communities, BIPOC communities, who are going above and beyond. We have survivors and sometimes people who are just like working within the organizations who refuse to even go into BIPOC communities, so then we have a lot of work that is placed on Black advocates and other BIPOC advocates because there are people who won't even touch those communities. And so when we look at services and the long-term impact, I think we need to go back to, and my final words would be go back to not censoring the margins, as Jayden so eloquently stated, in terms of like the gaze of the community, but actually like picking up and researching and figuring out the ways that we can tangibly assist the community. And we mentioned, creating strategic partnerships. Jayden mentioned that. And I just wanted to add, with the strategic partnerships, I think it's important to make sure that those partnerships are fair and just according to the community that is most impacted. Is this not just on paper, like, oh, we partnered, but it is like this partnership and this community has a hand in the policies. If there is something that happens with an advocate who has not been culturally sensitive or who has not who's just been playing racist or anti-Black, like there are repercussions from that is in the form of transformative justice, because we have our own systems of healing and accountability and things of that nature. So the long-term impact of systems and services, I think would be, going back to the fact that we have our own and to make sure that those are uplifted, and not just coming in as experts and, as Wanda said, white saviors who, like, we have this system and this is how we do this, and no, we have our own and don't impose yours on us. So I think the whole concept of services could also be revamped, but that's another panel for another day. I thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you today. And as always, Wanda and Jayden, it is always a pleasure to be in your company.
So this question, how will COVID impact services and whatnot in the long term? All the things already about COVID, but what I think a lot happened, and if we just look at 2020, like a lot happened. Yes, COVID and the uprisings for Black life, and like one of the largest marches for Black trans lives in New York. And like, I think we were in a pressure cooker and COVID just like set that off. But people were fed up, and it was a sort of moment of reckoning for a lot of folks, and how and required organizations and whatnot to pivot or shift and how they're doing work in many ways. So I think some of that, I'm hopeful. I believe I'm an Afrofuturist at heart, so I believe that there will be Black people in the future. And so I think one of the ways that can happen is if some of these pivots stay, in like little ways, like the ways that things went virtual for a lot of organizations just meant that things were more accessible, which, the disability justice movement has always given like guidance on how to be more accessible in your work to allow for more folks to be able to show up fully. And if we're, all of these different systems have disabled people, and particularly like Black disabled survivors who are, doing a lot of work. And so, the lessons are there. And so, and a lot of folks were able to adapt to, here we are having this conversation across the country. And so I hope that moving forward, that's something that stays for more organizations, focusing on how accessible are we being to whatever we're providing to folks. Not just with like virtual, but with like the spaces that we're in, the restrooms that we have, the languages that are provided, including ASL, all of that. So that's one thing. I think another thing that was illuminated with the folks who are doing the work was that capitalism wants us to work ourselves until we die. And the need is always going to be there, but if we work until we die, like if we just keep working, we're gonna make ourselves sick. And so the things like the NAP ministry, like elevated, other practices of Black liberation elevated, and more people were like, maybe I do need to rest, so another tool that meant people started adjusting to like work schedules, because we are, a lot of us, survivors in this movement to support survivors. And if we are, working within these systems, like how can we, as a co-executive director of an organization that is growing, like we constantly, my co-director and I talk about like, we're both survivors of child sexual abuse, living with complex PTSD and many other, mental health disabilities, physical disabilities. It's just the truth of, being descended from enslaved Black folks who experienced a lot. My body has inherited a lot of pain. That's my own experience. So that just means I can't move under white supremacy in the same way. And I think this moment of reckoning also challenged folks in like the shame that can come up if you're not performing in a certain way. And so, you know, it's one of the things that I practice now is for when I feel like I'm not performing in a certain way under capitalism, because the need is so great and the work is always there. You know, I'm on several different people's like crisis support teams, like people who are like, I can't call the state and I don't want to die. What do we do? Plus doing just trying to run an organization, you know. But I believe that shame is a tool of white supremacy. And, you know, Wanda reminded us all that ultimately white supremacy don't love none of us, don't love nobody, you know. And if shame is a tool of white supremacy, I can't let whiteness win. So I'm not going to shame myself for having to adjust to where I actually am. And so I think organizations who are doing this work, and all of us who are in the work to end and eradicate rape culture and gender-based violence, and what we're learning about ourselves during this moment is to incorporate more rest. And so I hope that more organizations and folks doing this work, you know, get the funding, make sure that your EDs are raising the funding to have like the kind of comprehensive leave that folks might need to, you know, create a culture and cultivate a culture where folks can be honest with you about their mental health and not feel like I might lose my job if I am honest that, like, I don't know, the death of Black people went viral again today and I can't. You know, I think, yeah, I think that shift in organizations and how we do the work is really important and necessary as well. And I think that's something that we started learning in COVID, and that people have whole lives, and, you know, like trying to do this work and like homeschool and all the things people had to do in this moment, like it wasn't working to keep going that way. And so I'm hoping for the folks offering the services that that shift stays. I'm hopeful that there will also be, you know, these kind of partnerships that, like Wanda was saying, that understand who needs to lead and who needs to lend. That the answers are in the communities. I also hope that people don't get complacent. The things that have been illuminated, you know, we're always shifting and evolving, and so the need needs to always shift and evolve. We need to just be willing and open to adapting as the needs shift and evolve. And I think my last thing that I'll say, that I learned from the work with this organization called Being Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective, is to sort of shift where, instead of, I think a lot of people have been like really scared of like white supremacy, like all the words, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, like, oh my God, like I don't want to be called this, you know, I don't want to be called transphobic, I don't want to be, we want to be doing our best. You will make mistakes. Like we will all make mistakes. And instead of asking or like being like, oh my God, I'm not this, I'm not that, like I encourage all of us who have been brought up and exist in this particular system of white supremacy to ask, where in my behaviors and thoughts and choices does anti-Blackness, does homophobia, does transphobia, does misogyny like exist? Because it does, you know, and that can support us. And I think folks get, you know, they get defensive. They're like, oh my God, I'm not. It's like, Sure, okay, but like we all are. Like, where does it show up? And I think with all of the things that happened in 2020 that were revealed, folks had to start thinking about, you know, where do I exist in all of this? And I'm hopeful, but we'll see, that folks will continue to ask these questions. Yeah, because otherwise, you know, we'll just have to wait until the next big thing happens to reveal once again how these systems actually work.
Thank you all so much for sharing all of your insight. Wanda, I heard you say dropping gems. An organization called To Men uses that. I love it as well. So you all dropped a whole lot of gems today. We appreciate it greatly. I hope the audience has enjoyed listening, you know, to these particular insights about this topic, right, and this perspective in particular. And thank you all so much for taking the time to be here and discussing these, you know, really pertinent conversations. Thank you.
I do have one question that just came in. How do you start this conversation with your agency?
I want to first start by saying hello. I am traveling, and so you may hear some nat sound, just natural life going on around me. But someone who's sitting here and watching this playback, I am so thankful once again for Annika and Jayden and the knowledge that they brought to this. Being able to start these conversations at agencies, I would first say that given that it's 2021 and a half and 3/4, it's about to be 2022, and given the year and years that we've had, if you have to start this conversation now, it's time. It's past time to have it. And I think that's how you start the conversation. I think you start by saying that this is a conversation that is long past due. I think specifically, often I get this question. I get this question from organizations when I'm helping them to overhaul and kind of see what kind of life can be made. One of the ways that we have to, one of the starting points is, how are you supporting your most vulnerable community members? That's the question that I think allows us to hit some fertile ground around conversation. And so I would also, another question that I also ask directly is, what did y'all do yesterday to unseat white supremacy within your organization? What did you do the day before within the community in which you sit that helped to unseat anti-Blackness? I think getting people to understand that these are not separate things, and that, as I said earlier, that oppression is the rhetoric that validates violence. Having a better understanding that the way in which we have been taught in this movement to support survivorship, to work to prevent violence, is incorrect. And it is done, and we have been trained to do this in a way that will sustain whiteness. Being able to understand that it is oppression that we have to look towards, that is upstream prevention. And I think having conversations around ways that you can bring in or start thinking about upstream prevention and including this is a great starting point.
Jayden or Annika, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'm sorry, I can't see if Jayden, were you gonna say something? I took it off of the view where I would see everything.
You can go, Annika. He just gave you the thumbs up.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, wow. I just like Wanda, I saw, I was there, we recorded it, but to go back and see it again was absolutely incredible. And yeah, I'm blown away, and I'm redigesting all of the information that has been shared. So that's kind of where I am. And I'm having some technical difficulties. So you may hear me, if that's like my computer deciding if it wants to work or not. So I apologize for that, but I'm just blown away. That's really where I'm at, just blown away. And LaWanda is very gifted and talented. If you all haven't, like all of us are, and LaWanda has an organization called Start by Talking. So if you all are really interested in doing the work, check out LaWanda's organization, because that's where the work begins.
That's awesome. Thank you. Okay, we have a next question, which is, it is difficult at times to get our white colleagues to understand that everything is interconnected. How do you advocate for work that includes work around healing from racial trauma?
I can jump in real quick. This is Jayden. I think we're in a moment where it's important for folks to have values within their organization and certain expectations that you set and agree upon in your organization. And if one of those values is racial justice, and your employees or coworkers or colleagues aren't in alignment with that work, then they aren't in alignment with your organizations, so should no longer work there. It's that simple. And that organizations have to be having these difficult conversations around racial justice, around gender justice, because all of that is connected to this larger work to end sexual violence. So yeah, for white folks who are feeling challenged, I think, like Annika was saying, hit up LaWanda and start by talking, but also make sure that the values of your organization reflect your commitment to racial justice, and that your employees or your coworkers or whoever understand that part of working with you is a commitment to those values. And be, firm in that boundary. I think, that can be scary. People get nervous about what that can mean for leadership. But leadership then needs to shift. If it's white leadership that doesn't want to address the reality of, intersectionality, then that leadership needs to shift. What is your organization doing to not only say you're committed to racial justice, but be in the practice?
And I would just add, so I was pushed out of a coalition that was full of anti-Blackness, and what I would say, and y'all not gonna like it. Y'all not gonna like it, and I don't care. Why are they so comfortable in the organization? That's my question. Why are they so comfortable? Because people of color, communities of color, Annika has lost employment as a single parent because my Blackness offended people, but they didn't lose their jobs. Annika has long-term chronic pain, just got 2 more diagnoses. Like, we are losing our lives. Our families are being murdered in the streets, but you uncomfortable and you don't want to address my lived reality. What is that? That makes no sense. I have so little tolerance for this, like, oh, well, it makes me uncomfortable. Like, it makes me uncomfortable to wake up and live with chronic pain every day, but I gotta do it. Meanwhile, somebody who denied my humanity is the reason I have chronic pain today. So for the white people who are in the audience, like, you gotta get over it. Like, you gotta get over it. We are dying, literally. This is not me begging for my humanity. This is me begging you to see your humanity. Because you're losing by missing out on all this greatness that we have to offer. You're losing, not us. I mean, we're losing our lives and our health, but I mean, we're losing your humanity and we're trying to hold on to ours while you try to figure it out. The end.
I think that's such a great, like, I think, oh, my brain is going in so many different directions right now. I would say that the first thing that I would say to piggyback off on what Annika said, what we have to understand about white supremacy is that even though no one signed up to exist under this default, even though this is a default that we all have to unlearn, we also have to understand that the price that you pay for benefiting from white supremacy is a loss of your humanity. White supremacy depends on you investing and exchanging your humanity for the structure to survive. That is what has sustained white supremacy for so long. Okay. And so I think it's also important for us to understand that when that happens, in connection to what both Annika and Jayden so eloquently stated, we have to be able to understand that me just getting up in the morning as I am, as Black and fat and nappy as I want to be, is a disruption to the system. White supremacy fails every time I acknowledge my humanity, every time I experience joy, every time I live. We need to understand that we are not creating homes in these systems. Bernice Reagan Johnson said, do you have a home or are you building a coalition? Because what we have to understand is that the co-opting of this particular movement also meant that white women of a particular type of power and privilege decided that the systems that existed above them, that oppressed them, needed to be kept out. And so they created systems, they created a system, a home for like-minded folks to be able to come in and have a place to be because of the oppression they were feeling. But when you create a space that makes no room for the people who experience a different level of oppression and are placed in a lower hierarchy than you have not created a space that will create change. You have not created a space that will save. You have not created a space that values the humanity of folks whose privileges are different. You have created a club. You have created a white woman's Tupperware party. Okay? And Bernice Reagan Johnson specifically says, why do you think diversity is supposed to make you feel good? Why do you think you're supposed to be comfortable? And if you're too comfortable in your organization, it is not a coalition, It's an extension of your home. Because see, no one has to question you in your home. You don't have to put on pants in your home if you don't want to. You're comfortable. And I think that there is a history that we can all agree to that these systems have just been too damn comfortable at the expense in the lives of Black people and other people of color. And that's what I'm adding to the speech.
Thank you so much to all three of you.